There is an uncomfortable silence that arises when someone is forced to be alone with themselves. Not the external silence, but the one that is born when all borrowed voices fall silent. It is at this moment that many feel fear, not because they have found something terrible within themselves, but because they have found almost nothing, an absence, a void disguised throughout life by the opinions of others, repeated gestures, inherited beliefs. What they call personality begins to crumble. And it is precisely here that Nietzsche approaches, not as a consolation, but as a merciless mirror. Nietzsche never spoke of personality as something given. For him, the self is not born ready-made. It is conquered, or never comes into existence. Most people live believing they possess a solid identity, when in reality they carry only a fragile collage of social habits, collective moralities, and desires that are not their own. The modern individual believes they are someone because they repeat patterns with conviction. But repeating is not being, it is obeying. Pay close attention. How many people do you know who truly think for themselves? Who could withstand having their certainties taken away without collapsing emotionally? Nietzsche called this a weak spirit, not due to a lack of intelligence, but due to a lack of inner depth. A human being without their own center is easily filled by ideologies, by fads, by ready-made speeches. Where there is no essence, anything will do. The illusion of personality is born early. We are taught to answer before thinking, to choose before understanding, to define ourselves before knowing ourselves. Who are you? They ask. And the answer comes automatically: profession, belief, musical taste, political position. None of them touch the core of being. They are functional labels, not real identities. Nietzsche saw in this a silent tragedy. Men and women passing through life without ever having truly been someone. According to the philosopher, most people don't live. They only react. They react to expectations, to the fear of exclusion, to the need for approval. This constant reactivity creates a sensation of movement, but not of direction. There is action, but no will. And where there is no will of one's own, there is no personality, only conditioned behavior. Nietzsche calls this gregarious life, the life of the herd, not as an insult but as a diagnosis. The herd doesn't need identity, only belonging. It moves together, thinks together, feels together. Individual personality would be a risk. It would demand confrontation, solitude, rupture. Few accept paying that price. It's safer to call the echo one's own voice. But then the uncomfortable question arises. If most people live empty lives, is that a flaw or an unconscious choice? Nietzsche suggested something even more disturbing. Emptiness protects. Having a real personality means enduring internal conflicts, carrying contradictions, enduring the tension of not fitting in. Emptiness is light. Emptiness doesn't demand responsibility. It adapts. That's why the illusory personality is so attractive. It allows one to live without creating their own values. It allows one to call what has been absorbed uncritically an opinion. It allows one to feel part of something bigger without ever having become something profound. The empty individual feels relief in dissolving into the mass. There, no one needs to explain themselves to themselves. Nietzsche offered no salvation for this. He offered a warning. Becoming someone is a violent process. It demands destroying comfortable versions of oneself, breaking with inherited truths, traversing periods of psychic solitude. Few endure this path. Therefore, few possess personality in the elevated sense of the word. The rest possess only a well-fitted mask. And perhaps the most dangerous question is not who am I, but what would remain of me if all external influences were removed, if the applause ceased, if the validation disappeared, if no one were watching. Nietzsche knew many would discover that they had never truly been present within themselves. This realization is not the end. It is the beginning, but only for those who do not run from it, because from this void, two possibilities arise: to fill it with even more illusions, or to embrace it as raw material. Nietzsche favored the second option, but warned, it is not for everyone. And it is precisely here that this journey begins. Not with comfortable answers, but with the unsettling suspicion that what you call self may never have been built, perhaps only inherited, perhaps only repeated, perhaps only tolerated. If this is true, the inevitable question is not whether you are empty. It is whether you will have the courage to let that emptiness speak, or whether you will continue to call silence identity. At some point, almost always without warning, the illusion begins to crumble. It doesn't happen in a grand dramatic event, but in small, almost banal scenes. An ordinary day, an ordinary conversation, a simple decision. Someone asks you what you really want, and you don't know how to answer. Or you realize you always react the same way, even when you promised yourself you would change. It's at this point that something strange happens. Life goes on, but you feel you're not really in it, as if you were just following a script you never wrote. Nietzsche knew this state well. He wasn't speaking from academic distance, but from the experience of someone who lived on the margins, observing modern man acting like an obedient cog in a machine. For him, most people confuse routine with identity. They wake up, work, opine, consume, get distracted, and call this movement who I am. But movement is not direction. There are active bodies with paralyzed souls. Consider how easily people adopt preconceived opinions. A headline, a catchy phrase, a short video, and immediately it becomes part of their self. They passionately defend ideas they've never tested in their own lives. Nietzsche saw this as a clear symptom. Where there is no formed personality, there is a need for belonging. Borrowed opinions offer psychological shelter. Thinking for oneself requires solitude, and solitude is frightening. There are also moments of silence, those rare instants when nothing distracts. No music, no screens, no conversations. Many flee from this inner space because a disturbing feeling of incoherence arises there. One realizes that one lives differently from what one claims to believe, that one acts against one's own discourses. Nietzsche called this inner disintegration. It is not conscious hypocrisy, it is fragmentation. The individual is not one, but a confused sum of contradictory impulses. And then the masks appear. The professional mask, the moral mask, the social mask. Each environment demands a different self. This seems like healthy adaptation, but over time it takes its toll. The more masks someone wears, the less they know who they are when they all fall off. Nietzsche didn't condemn masks per se. He warned against forgetting that we are wearing them. When the mask becomes the face, the personality is already lost. There is a powerful image in Nietzschean thought, that of the man who never puts himself to the test. He avoids internal conflicts, avoids decisions that require rupture, avoids anything that could disrupt his comfortable self-image. He lives in artificial equilibrium. But this equilibrium is fragile. A single crisis, a loss, a rejection, a failure, is enough to make everything crumble. The emptiness appears raw, without makeup. At this point, many rush to fill the void. More consumption, more distraction, more external validation. Nietzsche saw this as psychological decay. Not in a moral sense, but a vital one. A life that needs to be constantly anesthetized is not a strong life. It is a life that runs away from itself. What's most disturbing is that this condition has become normal. Being empty doesn't cause social strangeness. It causes comfort. Questioning oneself too much is seen as a problem. Depth is confused with negativity. Those who think too much complicate things. Nietzsche perceived this clearly. Sick societies produce superficial individuals and call that health. But there is a decisive moment, a silent point when someone realizes they can no longer pretend. That living by reacting is a slow way of disappearing. It's not yet the birth of personality, but it's the end of innocence. Something breaks. A suspicion settles in. Perhaps I never truly chose anything. This suspicion hurts, because it implies responsibility. If the void exists, it's not the world's fault. It's the result of repeated abdications, of avoided choices. Nietzsche didn't offer comforting excuses. He was saying, implicitly, nobody becomes someone by chance. Either you build yourself, or you will be built. And then comes the unexpected twist. Emptiness is not a mistake. It's a space, a possibility. What seemed like absence can be the ground where something authentic begins to form. but only if there is enough courage not to fill it with more noise. Nietzsche saw this stage as a dangerous crossing. Many turn back. They prefer the familiar anesthesia to the discomfort of transformation. Few advance. Few accept remaining long enough in this intermediate state, where one is no longer what one was, but is still nothing defined. It is at this threshold that the question changes. It is no longer, who am I? But what am I capable of becoming if I stop running away? From here, personality ceases to be a comfortable illusion and becomes a task, an unfinished work, a conscious risk, and Nietzsche remains there, not as a gentle guide, but as a demanding presence. He doesn't push, he only observes, like someone who knows that, from this point on, there is no return without loss, because after the void is seen clearly, feigning fullness becomes impossible, and it is precisely from this point of tension that the next movement is born. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when the individual completely ceases to deceive themselves. It is not a glorious awakening, nor a moment of enlightenment. It is more like a profound weariness of repeating gestures that lead nowhere, of maintaining personas that no longer convince even oneself. Nietzsche recognized this point as the real beginning of any transformation, when self-deception becomes too burdensome to continue. At this stage, something changes in the way a person observes the world. They begin to perceive previously invisible patterns. They notice how the same opinions circulate with different faces, how the same indignations appear in different mouths, always with the same tone, how most people don't think, they only react. Nietzsche saw this as an unconscious choreography, a theater where almost no one wrote their own part. This is where the first real rupture arises, the suspicion that thinking for oneself might mean distancing oneself, not just disagreeing, but moving internally, seeing what others don't see, questioning what cannot be questioned without social cost. Nietzsche called this the danger of thought, because thinking truly is not a neutral act. It exacts a price. But what happens when someone realizes their perspective is beginning to diverge from the majority? When what once seemed obvious becomes fragile? When collective certainties start to sound artificial? How many have the courage to endure this discomfort without running back to the safety of consensus? At this point, many try to negotiate with the void. They don't completely abandon the herd, but neither do they fully surrender to transformation. They create a moderate version of themselves. They question up to a certain point. They think, but not enough to change their lives. Nietzsche saw this as a refined form of spiritual cowardice, not out of malice, but out of fear of the solitude that accompanies lucidity. Because lucidity isolates, it creates distance. Whoever begins to see the workings of morality, culture, and public opinion can no longer move naturally within them. Everything starts to seem too rehearsed, too automatic. Nietzsche knew that this distancing is not arrogance. It is a consequence, a heavy consequence, often unwanted. There's a powerful image here, that of a man who can no longer fall back asleep after waking up in the middle of the night. He closes his eyes, tries to return to his previous state, but something has changed. The thought remains active. The unease persists. Similarly, once someone perceives the structural emptiness of most personalities, they can no longer pretend they didn't see it. But then the crucial question arises: what to do with this clarity? Use it as a shield to feel superior, or as a tool to build something more solid within oneself? Nietzsche despised the first path. For him, seeing without acting is merely a sophisticated form of stagnation. It is at this point that the idea of will begins to take on real form, not as a fleeting desire, but as an organizing force in internal chaos. Nietzsche did not believe that human beings are born with a clear will. It needs to be forged, honed, tested against resistance. Without confrontation, there is no will, only loose impulses. Here an uncomfortable revelation occurs. Many believe they lack personality because they have been oppressed, controlled, or conditioned. Nietzsche proposes something harder to accept. Most never wanted to bear the burden of creating themselves. They preferred the ease of being led. They preferred the absence of responsibility that comes with the absence of a strong self. How many choices have you truly made without relying on the approval of others? How many decisions stemmed from honest internal conflict, and not from the fear of disappointing, losing status, or seeming strange? How many times have you sacrificed deep intuition to maintain an acceptable image? Personality, in the Nietzschean sense, begins when someone accepts loss, losing belonging, losing psychological comfort, losing the feeling of being right in the eyes of others. This is the initial sacrifice. Without it, everything that is built is fragile, a castle supported by external expectations. Nietzsche didn't romanticize this process. He knew it generates resentment, doubt, exhaustion. There are moments when the individual questions whether it's worth continuing, whether it wouldn't be easier to go back, to dissolve back into the mass. This thought appears almost always. It's the final test before something new emerges. And then, almost imperceptibly, something begins to organize itself. Not a ready-made identity, but an axis, an internal center of gravity. Small, still unstable, but real. The person begins to act more coherently with themselves, even when it costs them, even when no one applauds, even when no one notices. This is a point that is rarely described. The construction of personality does not immediately bring visible strength. It brings silence. A silence different from that initial emptiness. Now it is not absence. It is restraint, undisplayed potential. Nietzsche saw in this a clear sign of spiritual maturation. But this new internal structure can still crumble. All it takes is a moment of weakness, a repeated concession, a betrayal of oneself. The personality at this stage is still a promise, not a consolidated reality. That is why Nietzsche insisted so much on the idea of constant testing. Nothing is guaranteed. And here comes the most uncomfortable question so far. Do you really want to become someone? Or do you just like the idea of not being like everyone else? Because the first requires continuous discipline. The second requires only talk. It is at this critical point that many lose their way again. But those who move forward no longer walk out of curiosity. They walk out of necessity. Because after reaching this level of consciousness, turning back would mean a kind of inner death. And it is precisely from this need that the next stage is born, the one in which the individual not only separates himself from the masses, but begins to create his own values. Not inherited, not negotiated, created. That's where the real risk begins. There's a little discussed moment in the journey of someone beginning to become someone, the instant the world reacts. Not with explicit violence, but with estrangement. Small changes in behavior begin to bother people. The person no longer automatically agrees, no longer laughs at the same things, no longer moves at the same pace. Nothing was announced, but something has changed. Nietzsche knew this phenomenon well. He knew that the creation of one's own values doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens through friction. There are curious historical accounts that illustrate this. Individuals who, by breaking with the moral or intellectual standards of their time, were first seen as eccentric, then as dangerous. Not because they were aggressive, but because they introduced something unpredictable, their own center. Nietzsche observed that societies tolerate almost everything, except those who cannot be easily classified. The unpredictable generates discomfort, and discomfort demands neutralization. It is at this stage that many face something unexpected, resistance from those close to them. Old friends seem more distant. Conversations that were once light-hearted become tense. Subtle comments emerge, laden with irony or disguised concern. You've changed. The phrase seems neutral, but it carries an implicit warning. Nietzsche saw this as a silent test. To what extent is someone willing to sustain their own transformation when it begins to have a real social cost? The curious thing is that this resistance is rarely accompanied by solid arguments. It manifests itself as a climate, as an atmosphere, as a growing feeling of inadequacy. This happens because the creation of one's own values does not threaten isolated ideas, but collective stability. When someone stops following automatic moral scripts, they expose, without saying a word, the arbitrary nature of those scripts. And that is more unsettling than any open criticism. Nietzsche perceived something even deeper. Many do not attack the individual in transformation out of intellectual disagreement, but out of psychological self-preservation. The presence of someone who chooses for themselves acts as an involuntary mirror. It reminds others of everything that has been abandoned, postponed, or never faced. And not everyone can bear this reminder. There are also improbable events in this process. People who appear out of nowhere drawn to this new attitude. Unexpected relationships, rarer but more intense dialogues. Nietzsche believed that when someone begins to organize their life from an internal axis, they begin to resonate differently in the world. They don't attract crowds, but they do attract decisive encounters. At this point, something curious happens internally. The individual begins to realize that their choices are no longer guided primarily by fear. Fear still exists, but it has lost central control. There is a strange sense of alignment. Even difficult decisions seem simpler because they are connected to one's own criteria. Nietzsche saw this as a sign that the will is beginning to structure itself in a stable way. But this stage is not safe. On the contrary, this is where many stumble. The initial feeling of coherence can generate overconfidence. The person begins to believe that it has already become something definitive. Nietzsche warned against this trap. For him, every rigid identity is a new prison. The creation of values is not a destination, but a continuous process of revision and overcoming. There are psychological accounts that confirm this. Individuals who break with old patterns, but quickly crystallize new beliefs as absolute truths. They exchange one dogma for another. Nietzsche would call this weakness disguised as strength. The truly strong spirit does not cling even to its own creations. It tests them. It pushes them. It abandons them, if necessary. At this advanced stage, solitude changes in quality. It is no longer absence but selectivity. The individual does not isolate themselves out of rejection of the world, but out of necessity. Fewer relationships, less noise, less dispersion. Nietzsche saw this economy of energy as essential to sustaining the continuous creation of the self. A personality in formation cannot allow itself constant leaks. Something improbable also begins to happen. The past loses power. Guilt, regret, old narratives about who I was cease to dictate present decisions. Nietzsche called this liberation from dead weight. It's not about forgetting, but about not allowing the past to determine the value of the present. This change is subtle, but profound. Externally, life may even seem simpler. Fewer events, less drama. Internally, however, there is a controlled intensity, a feeling of being more fully present. Nietzsche believed this was one of the rare signs of spiritual health in a sick culture. When someone lives less scattered, less fragmented, less divided against themselves. But there is still a danger ahead. A danger that comes not from the outside, but from within. The risk of becoming too hard, inflexible, of confusing fidelity to oneself with rigidity. Nietzsche knew that the line between strength and hardening is thin, and that crossing it without realizing it is easier than it seems. This is where the question shifts again. It's no longer about who am I or what values have I created, but something more demanding. Am I capable of continuing to surpass myself without turning into a statue? Am I capable of sustaining my uniqueness without transforming it into empty pride? The answer to this is not immediate. It requires one last internal shift, an even rarer stage, one in which the individual learns not only to create values, but to live as if responsible for asserting their own existence in the face of the world's chaos. This is the stage that Nietzsche reserved for a select few, and it is toward him that the next step points. There comes a point when the entire inner structure is put to the test by something beyond our control. It's not a chosen test, it's an impact, an unexpected event that ignores all previous efforts at internal organization. A sudden loss, a betrayal, a public failure, an illness, a sharp fall in status or meaning. Nietzsche knew that this is where almost all newly formed personalities reveal their fragility, because until then, the individual had been strengthening themselves under relatively stable conditions. Now, the ground shifts. The curious thing is that this moment doesn't arrive as a solemn warning. It comes like any other day. The difference lies in what comes after. Something breaks the internal continuity. Certainties no longer respond. Established values are pressured by a reality that doesn't ask permission. Nietzsche saw this as the great sieve of existence, not what one thinks when everything is under control, but what remains when control disappears. This is where many retreat. Everything that had been achieved begins to seem too heavy. The temptation to abandon the path and return to easy explanations reappears with force. The herd offers immediate shelter, ready-made justifications, external culprits, comforting narratives. Nietzsche understood this impulse. He did not despise it, but he made it clear, those who give in here rarely return. There is a silent reversal at this point. Suffering, which previously seemed like an enemy, reveals an unexpected function. It exposes hidden flaws. It shows where values were still fragile, where the will still depended on favorable conditions. Nietzsche saw suffering not as punishment, but as revelation. It does not create strength from nothing. It reveals whether it already existed. Some try to resist by hardening themselves. They become cold, rigid, closed off. They cut off affection, despise the world, build an inner fortress. Nietzsche warned that this is just another form of weakness. Hardening is not overcoming, it is frozen fear. The true test is not enduring the impact by closing oneself off, but remaining affirmative even when wounded. At this stage, something decisive happens. The individual realizes that they can no longer sustain their identity merely as a reaction to the world, nor as opposition, nor as escape. They need to respond from another place, a deeper, less defensive place. Nietzsche called this the tragic affirmation of life, not accepting what happens because it is good, but because it happens, without appeals, without resentment. This is a rare turning point. Many confuse acceptance with resignation. Nietzsche made a clear distinction. To resign oneself is to give up internally. To affirm is to assume the weight of reality without bowing to it. It is to say yes to life even when it contradicts desires, plans, and personal narratives. Few manage to sustain this yes. Externally, nothing grand happens. Life goes on. People follow their routines. The world doesn't recognize this internal movement, but something changes irreversibly. The individual ceases to feel like a victim of chance. He doesn't come to control it, but he stops being crushed by it. There is a strange, active serenity. Not passive calm, but firmness. Nietzsche saw this stage as a dangerous transition, because here arises a final temptation to transform one's own overcoming into a final identity, to see oneself as someone who has won. This thought, if embraced, corrodes everything. The imaginary victory replaces the real process. Personality crystallizes, and the movement dies. Therefore, the tension does not diminish. It changes form. Now the conflict is no longer between the individual and the world, but between the individual and his own tendency to settle into the newfound strength. Nietzsche insisted, every form of prolonged rest is decadence. There is no end point. There is no definitive state. At this point, something unsettling becomes clear. True personality does not bring permanent peace. It brings continuous responsibility. It is not a shelter, it is a position, a stance in the face of chaos. Maintaining it requires constant vigilance against resentment, against rigidity, against the desire for recognition. And then comes the final turning point of this stage. The individual realizes that they no longer seek to prove anything, neither to others nor to themselves. The need for validation dissolves. The external gaze loses centrality. Action becomes guided by a silent, almost impersonal internal criterion. Nietzsche saw this as a sign of rare maturity. Still, nothing is guaranteed. Everything can be lost again. And that's not a threat, but part of the game, because only that which can be lost demands real presence. Personality now is not a possessed object, but a sustained movement. It is in this unstable, lucid, and demanding state that the path approaches its end, or rather, its final formulation. Because one question remains that has not yet been fully addressed. a question that definitively separates those who have merely differentiated themselves from those who have truly learned to assert their own existence. And it is this question that concludes the journey. We have reached the point where this entire journey needs to cease being merely intellectual understanding and become concrete action. Nietzsche never wrote to create attentive spectators, but to provoke real transformations. For him, thinking without acting was just another way of postponing life. Therefore, this conclusion is not a summary, nor a comfortable ending. It is a silent, direct summons, impossible to ignore without internal cost. If there's one thing that runs through everything said so far, it's this: personality isn't something you discover, it's something you build. And this construction doesn't happen through grand, heroic decisions, but through small, repeated, almost invisible choices. The way you react when no one is watching, the kind of thinking you allow to linger, the concessions you accept to make every day to avoid discomfort. Nietzsche knew that most people wait for a major event to change. A collapse, a loss, a revelation. But he warned, those who depend on external shock to awaken have already surrendered control of their own lives. The path he proposes is both more difficult and simpler at the same time. Difficult because it demands constant vigilance. Simple because it begins now, exactly where you are. Putting this into practice means starting with something essential. Stop lying to yourself. Not the social lie, but the internal one. The one that tells you that you have no choice, that that's just how it is, that it's impossible to change now. Nietzsche saw these phrases as moral anesthetics. Every time you accept them, you postpone the formation of your own center. The second step is to take responsibility without drama. Responsibility not as guilt, but as power. If you recognize that you chose less than you could have, that also means you can choose more from now on. Not everything, not all at once, but something. A limit imposed, a sustained decision, a habit abandoned, a truth told to yourself more clearly. Nietzsche believed that personality begins to emerge when the individual establishes a non-negotiable internal criterion, something that does not submit to applause or fear. Ask yourself with brutal honesty, what in me is truly mine? What do I do because I chose to, and not because I absorbed it? Where am I living out of inertia? The third step is to accept selective solitude. Not the solitude of resentful isolation, but the solitude of focus. You don't need to break with the world, but you need to reduce the noise. Fewer opinions of others, fewer comparisons, fewer distractions that occupy the space where your will should grow. Nietzsche saw silence as an essential condition for any real deepening. Next, practice the daily test. Test your values in action, not in words. See where you fail. See where you still seek approval. See where you still retreat. Not to punish yourself, but to adjust. Personality is not built with pride, but with precision. Each correction made with clarity strengthens the inner axis, and perhaps the most difficult step, affirming life as it is. Not waiting for everything to align before acting. Not demanding guarantees before committing to oneself. Nietzsche called this saying yes to reality, a yes that doesn't deny pain, but also doesn't bow to it. A yes that transforms suffering into raw material, not an excuse. If you apply this, something changes slowly. Not spectacularly, but consistently. You begin to feel less need to explain who you are, less urgency to constantly assert yourself, less fear of being misunderstood. Your presence becomes firmer, quieter, harder to displace. This is personality in formation. And here is the ultimate truth that Nietzsche never softened. This path does not promise constant happiness. It promises integrity. It promises inner coherence. It promises a life lived with greater depth, even when it is difficult. For some, this is enough. For others, it is too heavy. The choice is not moral. It is existential. If you've made it this far, something inside you has already begun to stir. Perhaps still confused, perhaps still fragile, but real. Don't let it dissipate. Use this discomfort as a starting point, not as a passing curiosity. Now, I want to hear from you. If this video touched on something you recognize, leave a comment. It can be anonymous, it can be brief, it can be just one word. If this content made sense, like the video so it reaches other people who are also on this threshold. And if you want to continue this thought process, subscribe to the channel, because becoming someone isn't an event. It's an ongoing process, and it always begins with a simple gesture, deciding to no longer live as if you were empty.